right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for tonight's webinar on prescribed burns. I'm Sarah Vokes. I'm the Conservation Manager at Heartlands Conservancy. And while everyone is still signing into the webinar, I'm just going to go over a couple of announcements and random things before we get started with the real presentation. So the first thing that I wanted to mention was some upcoming events that might be of interest to you. So the next up is a volunteer day at Arlington Wetlands on Monday, January 18th from 9:30 to noon. You can find more information about that on the Heartlands Conservancy website or our social media channels. Then on the 23rd of January, Saturday, we have a Saturday volunteer day at Bohm Woods from 9 to noon. You can also find more about that on website and social media. And then there's an exciting webinar from Grow Native coming up on February 4th about native plant garden planning, and it'll include lots of information about site prep, seed germination, and many other things. There will be more information coming out on that in the next couple weeks. So look for that being announced on social media and websites. So with that, I will kick off our first webinar of our 2021 webinar series, which we'll plan to have these webinars on the third Thursday of every month for the rest of the year. At 6 p.m. So tonight's topic is prescribed burn, and we're recording this webinar, and if you have to log out early or you just want to watch it again or you want to share with friends, it will be available on our YouTube channel tomorrow. We'll also be sending out a follow-up email to everyone who's registered. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our first speaker. James Scott Moss is an assistant professor, coordinator of restoration ecology, environmental science, stormwater management at Lewis and Clark Community College. He is a Illinois prescribed fire manager, a U.S. Navy veteran, and received his Master's of Science in Biology from SIUE. So, Scott, I will turn over the presentation to you, and you can teach us all about fire ecology.
Well, thank you very much. And welcome everybody tonight. Really appreciate the opportunity to sit here and talk about fire ecology, which is something I'm sort of really passionate about. And certainly I can think just on the top of my head about 5 or 6 people who are far more qualified to teach this class than I am, but I was on the phone list, I guess, and so easily accessible. But do my best, give you guys a good feel for what we're doing here. This is a lecture that I give in the fall field biology class. So all of my program students get this lecture as part of the larger context of fire ecology and use of fire as a management tool.
Scott, I'm sorry. I'm going to interrupt you just for a second because I forgot one order of business that is kind of important. If anyone has questions along the way, please drop them in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and we'll answer them after the presentation. Okay? Sorry.
It's all right. It's all right. So when we think of fire, we were kind of having this discussion as a group prior to everybody coming in. You know, we talk about how it really is seen in the modern context as this big natural disaster problem. We fear it in many ways, and so there's this whole history of how we relate to fire. But in reality, it's just a natural part of the disturbance regime of most ecosystems. Certainly, it's more important in some than it is in others. But it was a naturally occurring thing, although we have to really kind of take a hard look at ourselves and ask, what does natural really mean? And the reality is, if you go back and you dig into the archives and you talk to the right people, you'll find that much of the fire cycle, especially through our area, of North America was driven by human populations as they became much larger throughout history. And so, as an example, the Illinois prairie, the tall grass prairie, or the prairie state, that we are, much of the prairie in Illinois, there's a good argument to be made that it was, anybody who's tried to maintain a prairie here locally will know that it goes to trees pretty quickly in the absence of management and fire. And, fire is not easy to initiate around here. And we were, again, talking about that, how difficult it is sometimes to get a good quality burn. And so this was probably more of as much a human-driven thing as it was anything else. What we do know about it is that it's got a huge role in population density. It's a known density-independent driver of populations. It has a role in nutrient cycling and the way in which nutrients cycle through and between ecosystems and biomes, and that it does, in many cases, have a significant role in either the control of pests and pathogens, or even the spread and the distribution of those same things. And then finally, the biggest thing that we absolutely know is that when you have a frequent disturbance regime like fire, and flooding and other disturbances do the same thing, you end up with a ecosystem that's in multiple stages of succession, which leads to increased biodiversity. And so I can't, with the time that we've got allotted, I don't have time to play this video. There's a link here that's in my presentation that goes to a New York Times video thing. It's available, open source availability. It's really, really good. It focuses specifically on the 1988 fires that occurred in Yellowstone. And of course, I always joke, I don't remember this event, not because I wasn't old enough, but because I was in boot camp that summer. And this entire summer, most of the Yellowstone was on fire, and it captured the nightly news every night, was the lead story of many nights. But we didn't get to see the news. So I only remember this in the context of now using it as a teaching tool. But it is a great case study because it shows sort of the relationship that we have to fire with regards to policy. And policy is one thing, and then there's the public perception thing. And the video shows extensively sort of how these things play out in the school of public perception and the way the public views these things. And of course, then there's the ecological side of it, which we understand, in varying levels, and how well we understand the role of fire in these ecosystems is still being established. But there's clearly an ecological role to this thing. And then finally, and this is probably the more recent piece that this makes for a great case study, is that the way we relate to fire now is shaped as much by the fact that we've sprawled, our urban areas have sprawled out, and there's this urban interface between what has traditionally been kind of open wild lands and now our suburban lands that are sort of intermixed. And so when we see wildfires now on the TV, it's usually in the context of how it's threatening human settlements or human infrastructure. But it's a great case study, and we use it in our class to illustrate this. And I certainly encourage everyone to watch that, because it does a great job of telling the story in a simple 20-minute video. And of course, post 1988, when you fast forward 30 years and you realize what the ultimate outcome of the Yellowstone fire, after the president and the Secretary of the Interior and all these other people were basted on TV, literally roasted over the fire, pun intended, you realize that this was actually a very positive event. When you think of the changes that have taken place in Yellowstone over those ensuing 30 or 35 years, in the lens of decades or centuries, it's really been a positive thing. And so Yellowstone's seen a lot of changes since that 1988 fire, and not all of them due to the fire. The reintroduction of wolves in the mid-1990s has been famously focused on in the recent years. But the landscape that was used to introduce those wolves was that post-fire landscape with its own set of issues that were coming up. And so when you think of it in the context of just that single event, that 1988 fire, it just really tells you that in the fire was allowed to sort of hit the reset button on thousands of acres of this forested area that was in Yellowstone, and has sort of changed that landscape really for the positive. And again, that's on a centuries level scale. And so we got the, again, the video here, this picture here, naturally reseeded by a wildfire in 1988. These are lodgepole pines and other types of trees that just were not recruiting back into that system because they're fire dependent. And so as we think of what the 20th century, which really this entire thing is in the context of that short geologic timeline, and nothing in the geologic timeline, but a century in the human timeline, which seems like a long time. So the 20th century kind of ushered in, we had the big burn of 1910, which was really that first big catastrophic event that sort of really woke people up to this concept, this idea, the danger of wildfires as a threat to our infrastructure. And I think if you stop and put that 1910 fire into the context of what people were like, again, we tend to forget that that's 110 years ago. And it was an era we were building the Suez Canal, or just built the Suez Canal. We were building the Panama Canal. And in the context of where we stood as human beings, we just assumed that we could engineer our way out of any problem and control nature. And so the very thought that, nature was going to get over on us and burn up half of Idaho and big parts of Wyoming and Western Washington or Eastern Washington, that was not going to be allowed. So, President Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, and, the Forest Service, which was in its infancy at the time, really sort of took on that role. And the Smokey the Bear era, Smokey the Bear hadn't even been conceived at that time. Again, he was a public service thing that took place decades later. But the concept was that any fire that was started had to be put out. And so it was an extraordinary effort in the building of watchtowers and the manning of stations in far and wide areas. And anytime that smoke popped up on the horizon, we ran out there and we put it out. And that continued for 50 or 60 years until we sort of changed in the way we looked at it. And so if you just sort of think about it, this is actually a tower that's still down in the Mark Twain National Forest. You go on Highway 67 south from Fredericktown. That tower is out to the west from there. It's still there. You can still go out and visit. It's not manned. None of those towers are manned anymore. A lot of them are just left as sort of remnants from this system of watchtowers that used to exist. And of course, they were very effective because from those towers, anytime that any smoke, you've ever seen the smoke from a wildfire, the smoke from a prescribed fire, from the right vantage point, it's really an extraordinary event when you see it. And so they were able to use these towers and the system of signaling to really move people out to attack these things very quickly. And so there was, again, a good 4 or 5 decades where this was the norm, where any wildfire that came up was immediately attacked and suppressed. And that went on until we started really calling that into question because it started to usher in a completely different landscape around us. And so that fire watch response system was starting to be questioned more and more. It was very manpower intensive. Again, context is everything. This thing kind of reached its peak in the 1930s and into the 1940s when we had the huge movements, employment of people by the federal government, and the creation of these much larger groups, departments of within the federal government that would employ lots and lots of people. And that got increasingly costlier as we moved sort of post-World War II. And so the costs kept going higher, but the effectiveness of the policy kept decreasing. It got harder and harder and harder to go out and catch these fires in time and to put them out. And of course, that was primarily because we just started to see this immediate change in the landscapes where the species composition started to change, succession started to move on us, which started to change these landscapes. And then there were increased fuel loads, which then meant that anytime a fire did kick off, by the time you mobilized the cavalry, it was up in the crown and it was almost impossible to stop. So we really started to see that this was a policy that wasn't going to work. You kind of point to very specific changes in policy, very quiet changes in policies that took place really probably through the 1960s into the 1970s. And so what we learned from all this is that periodic fires, more frequent fires, would prevent the loading up of that fuel. And again, this is a discussion point that's been going on very vocally in recent times. We have these huge catastrophic fires that are because we have lots and lots of fuel loading up in the understory. And so when you have all this fuel sitting on the ground, especially in these very dry areas out west, it doesn't take much to really get this fire going in a way that can't be stopped. It's just not humanly possible to stop them. I talk to people all the time about this, and I get comments all the time. Well, we could put a person on the moon. We can't stop a wildfire. I'm like, well, have you ever stood in front of a 50-foot flame moving at 10 or 12 miles an hour? I mean, that'll change your perspective of it quite quickly. And so these more frequent fires are really the better way to go about this. We know that we're going to have fire. We know it's a natural part of the landscape around us, and it reduces those fire fuel densities, and it reduces those ladder fuels, which can put it up in the canopy where it spreads really rapidly and really dangerously. And of course, the other thing that we've come to realize is that when you lack fire, then these species that can colonize, a lot of times species that are more fire vulnerable, grow quicker, put on more biomass, and don't handle the drought conditions very well, those species will then colonize, which then adds kind of fuel to the fire, literally. And so what we've seen in the second half of the 20th century were these huge high intensity fires and this complete stand replacement. In restoration ecology and sort of the textbook terms, we call that a threshold shift. And once you initiate a threshold shift in an ecosystem, it really can't succeed back in the direction it came from without restoration assistance. And that's why we're seeing some significant changes, especially in areas through the middle part of the country where this was removed, but we don't have the big threat of catastrophic fires. So as you would see in the video, if you watched it, this was referred to in the 1988 fire specifically as the let it burn policy. Nowhere in any policy or any memo anywhere from the Department of Interior, you're going to see this listed as the policy. It's just the policy was naturally occurring fires would be allowed to go out on their own and only be dealt with if they threatened humans or infrastructure. And fire does a lot of really good things for the ecosystem. We talked about nutrient cycling. When you look at nutrient cycling specifically, all those nutrients that are locked up in biomass, that are in those trees, that are in those plants, even plants that are dead and just sitting there, those key nutrients, especially nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, NPK, those are locked up and they're not accessible to new plant growth and to new successional systems. And fire releases those back into the system and lets them leach into the soil, where then they can move around and be picked up and reincorporated into new biomass of plants and animals. And so this allows stuff to move sort of within the ecosystems. It plays into the interconnectivity of the trophic food web systems, and it plays into the development of soils as well. And also, again, when you think about how it really works, the fire burned landscape is prone to erosion. We know there's some downsides to this thing, but even erosion in this context moves nutrients off of that site into other places where they might be needed. So this is just a release mechanism for key nutrients and key nutrient cycling systems. And what we know about high intensity fires, or these catastrophic fires, is that they tend to skip that step. When you have a high intensity fire, it'll volatilize a lot of these things. Specifically, nitrogen is really prone to this, so it kicks it sort of in a more volatile state way up into the atmosphere, where it moves long distances and often has a completely different sort of chemical reaction when it returns. And so that's a negative. So we know that the more frequent low intensity fires sort of have a positive feedback with nutrient cycling, and these more volatile systems are much more negative. And also, high intensity fires have a notable effect on soil microorganisms, which also drive these nutrient cycles. The nitrogen cycle specifically is driven by bacteria, and when you have a high intensity fire, the bacteria tend to at least get knocked way back. Again, it's a population control system, and so that cycling, that natural cycling of things like nitrogen, will stop or will slow significantly for a while. And of course, with pest control, again, the whole reason I set fires really is pest control, right? I'm trying to keep invasive species, or I'm trying to keep plants that shouldn't be there from invading or from increasing in population in my ecosystems. But specifically, when you look at sort of how fire can be seen as a benefit to the ecosystems, we know that populations kind of get negatively impacted by fire, and so that often assists with control. Again, it's depending on who you talk to, why do we set prescribed fires through woodlands? Well, that thins tree species out. Even desirable tree species, some of them will succumb to the fire, and that thins them out, and it allows others to sort of grow more rapidly, and it gives you a better structural system. With things like insects, the high temperatures and the smoke, that'll kill all stages of life, adults, the larvae, the eggs. And then, of course, that again, you reduce those populations, it just creates lower densities, and it sort of prevents their ability to spread or to become problematic or to become a nuisance. And it certainly isn't true with everything. Anybody who's been around fire long enough knows that when you burn across some situations or some conditions, it actually creates habitat, or it increases the ability for some pest species to get in there. So, Sericea lespedeza is kind of one that, I noticed on our prairies out at the campus. We really didn't catch it in time, and we put a couple fires through, and the next thing you know, I've got, Sericea lespedeza out there in noticeable populations because fire actually improves its capability of spreading in those conditions. So it's not a be-all, end-all for pest control. Like anything else, it's a tool that has to be applied appropriately and with the understanding of what you're trying to do. Other controls, again, spore germination and inhibition in fungi. Smoke can control the germination of spores. Again, fungus are a natural part of the ecosystem. Like anything else, they can become sort of problematic, or certain ones can become problematic. Probably more simply, just the removal, the dead trees or dying trees, things that are sort of already weakened in the system. Fire will come along and will remove them so that they're not a vector for attachment or spread of problematic species. And again, fire will promote the spread of some pathogens. There's known examples where the smoke can carry the spores of different things, or can carry, different pathogens that can move then from one place to another, from tree to tree. But as a general rule, these are pretty low likelihood and not very common. And of course, the big thing that we advocate this for is just the maintenance of biodiversity. And so since many of our systems locally are fire adapted, and a lot of the plants locally come with significant fire adaptations, things like the thick cork cambium of oak trees, and or many tree species that are around here, or the serotinous cones of those pines out west, or the deep root systems of perennial plants, rapid dispersal mechanisms of many plants. If you've ever again, goldenrod as an example, we fight it terribly on the campus because our burns tend to move through the area, burns off everything, and then leaves these goldenrods, seed-laden goldenrods, standing all winter long. And, we have to go out and remove those, oftentimes, and think about what we're doing with them. Otherwise, our fire just creates habitat for more goldenrod. That's just the way in which many these native plants have evolved under fire conditions to disperse and to move. And of course, all this is natural selection driven. Everything here comes at some growth or metabolic expense. I tell my students all the time, nothing in biology comes for free. If you take one pathway with these adaptations, then you're sort of surrendering another pathway, or you're surrendering something else. Nothing comes for free. I mean, trade-offs to be made at every stage in biology. So what we end up with is a natural selection-driven system that is in many stages of development, which leads to a ton of biodiversity in these systems. There. So what we see is that good quality fire, the kind of fire that we're advocating for, the one that's both manageable and controllable, is going to leave a mosaic of disturbance across the habitat. It's microhabitat driven. You're going to have low spots that are going to be wetter or going to have higher humidity, and they're not going to burn very well. You're going to have the high and dry spots that are going to burn pretty hot, pretty hard, and then there's going to be every kind of variation in between. So when we see how habitat diversity correlates with biodiversity, and again, this is just a sort of a known thing that takes place in ecology. The more habitat diversity you have, the higher the biodiversity that's going to be associated with that. And so good quality fire on a relatively frequent, but again, not too frequent scale is going to create this habitat mosaic, which is going to increase the amount of different species that are going to use it. And that leads directly to those plant-animal associations, which again is just sort of the base level for trophic flow and coevolutionary processes. And then of course, at the bigger scale, when we talk about it, especially from a restoration standpoint, that increase in biodiversity is just going to increase resilience. It's going to increase resistance in those systems. It's going to make for healthier systems. And so you end up with this. So again, this is a fire that's moved across, come from one set of woods to the other. You can see where it's left patches that have been completely unburnt. You can see where it's burned sort of lightly in some other places. There's patches of woods that were unburnt. And so you can see that now ecological succession is going to proceed forward from this point in many different stages with lots of different access for lots of different species. And of course, there's the wildlife impacts. There are always short-term impacts. You know, I don't ever go in front of anybody and say, "Oh no, it's no big deal. We're not going to hurt anything." Not true. I mean, we are burning plants off. We're burning the plant cover off. We are having a significant impact to the plant community, and there's going to probably be some small impact to the animals. Again, the removal of vegetative cover just immediately makes it sort of it favors predators. I've seen it. I've been, you know, on larger burns where it seems to draw things like predatory birds in. They sense and they get the feel that's gonna create opportunity for them. And so it sort of favors the hunters over the hunted for a short period of time. But again, most studies that you look into it have showed that there's relatively low mortality rates due to the fire itself. It just, again, I had a board member of an organization, you know, not far from the college. We did a burn for them, and this board member just referred to the burn as a turtle bake. It was every time it was brought up, he's like, "Oh yeah, the turtle bake." Well, again, we're not intentionally trying to kill turtles. Some turtles get burnt, and we try to do everything we can do to avoid that. But the reality is that it's a relatively low thing. Anybody's ever been on a prescribed fire has seen a rabbit go tearing out of the gap with a little bit of steam going off of it. But I've yet to see, and I've been on hundreds of burns, I'm yet to see an animal come flying out with its fur on fire. I'm sure it's happened, but I've never seen it. But the real impact is to things like cavity nesting birds and to small cavity nesting mammals, and that's why we have to be really careful about preparation, site prep. We at the college we're really trying. Again, this is a matter of practicality, but it's also a matter of ecology. We don't want to burn those big snags. We don't want to burn off all that stuff where those animals have an opportunity to hide, because that does have a pretty negative impact when you start torching those things. Whether or not it's getting them while they're in the process of nesting or just preventing the process of nesting going forward, that can have an impact. The longer term impacts beyond that, it's habitat driven, and it's cycles with a lot of different systems of periodicity, and so the fire tends to be a relatively small player in that. And of course, when we use this as a management tool, when we understand the ecology and you get into it, the specifics of it become very tightly tied to land use history and to the types of soils and the moisture levels and topography. Anybody who's taken training in prescribed fire, we spend a lot of time talking about these things, specifically in the planning part of it. The influence of wind and aspect and weather and the different plants and the field types. And so all of these things are going to play into it. And of course, with a good maintenance system using prescribed fire, you're going to get a variety of all this, which is going to increase the sort of success rate of it over the long term. Increased fire frequency does tend to favor early successionals. We're experiencing this on the campus. We're burning a lot more than I would really probably like to, but just because we have such a huge problem with invasive species, we're trying, mission number one is get the invasive species off, and then we'll start worrying about some of the other things. And so we do have a lot of sort of early successional weedy native species that are now dominating the campus. It's okay, at least they're native at this point, right? So we'll take the small victories. If you understand the way the populations work, the ecology of the plants, the good systems of monitoring, then you can kind of come up with the right frequency for your site. But the general kind of rule, with grasslands, we think in terms of like every 2 to 5 years, forested areas with 5 to 15 years. And this is sort of looking at historic rates and maintenance rates. I think I've got another slide that talks about sort of the recommended maintenance rates. Again, there are forested areas that maybe only burned once every 100 years. But again, there was somewhere in the time frame where they were going to be exposed to fire as a natural occurrence. And of course, here in the Midwest, again, I joke about it. I know when we first started talking about burning up at the college, I had to go to multiple board meetings because it terrified people, and justifiably. It's you're setting things on fire near very expensive buildings, near very expensive equipment, near human populations. And they all showed up for the first burn, and they were all incredibly disappointed because all it did was smoke and smolder, and it was really very boring. And we spent 6 hours out there just moving around in the smoke with nothing really show for it. That's musification. That's the sort of the recruitment of shadier and damper type species into these systems, which then prevent us from having the good quality burns that we would want. And of course, fragmentation and edge effect play into this thing, the changing distributions of biomass. When we burn systems, here, at least in the area around the college, the big thing is those ladder fuels. There are vines everywhere. And, we're always dealing with vines, which wouldn't normally be a problem on a much larger system simply because there's all those edges. We've got, much denser canopy stands. We've got closed canopies. And that leads to sort of a more rapid cycling and turnover of soil litter, which reduces our fuel loads, which then increases sort of throughput and leaching. So the entire way in which our forests sort of exist in relation to us, or us in relation to them, has sort of made it harder for those things to be managed with fire. And so honestly, we joke about it all the time. It's hard to set a good fire these days. When I tell people, they ask me, if you got a prairie, about every 3 to 10 years. Again, that's all driven by the way it's succeeding. Everything is looked at in the lens of adaptive management. If you're getting a lot of trees that are recruiting in there, then 10 years is probably going to be not frequent enough. But if you're doing it every 3 years and you keep doing it every 3 years, you're going to end up with a solid stand of grasses. And so it's all about adaptive management. Savannas, you're just going to push that thing to the right a little bit, 7 to 15. Woodlands about every 12 to 25 years. And of course, these are numbers that are sort of based off of a good, again, resilient and resistant system that's full of native species. So, sorry, my bad. These were historic numbers. There's the maintenance numbers there. So again, you'll notice these things are going to be a little more frequent than the historic norms, just because of the way in which we've modified the habitats around us. And so kind of in summary, we understand now, after 100 years of looking at this thing and good ecological data, that we need these fires. Fires are a natural part of our landscape, whether they're human set or whether they're set by lightning strikes. They're a necessary part of the disturbance regime. It's an effective management tool. In fact, sometimes it is absolutely the best management tool. But you always have to look at it from cost-benefit analysis. A good fire will clear out and will do the things it needs to do in a matter of hours, when mowing might take a couple of days at great expense. So there's a cost-benefit analysis that has to be applied to it, and that always has to be weighed in terms of risk management. It's not always the right management tool. We all in restoration ecology and in conservation management, this is the one we like to do. This is the one we're all fired up and ready to do all the time. It's not always the right decision. And so, the cooler heads always have to prevail and make sure that the right decisions are being made. And then finally, the negative perceptions have to be overcome. I mean, we're not out here trying to burn the world down. We're not out here. I mean, I'm not a pyromaniac. I mean, sometimes I might look like one, but I'm not. It's not, you know, I enjoy working prescribed fire, but it's probably the hardest that I work on the job that I'm on at any given time, right? Timber stand improvement and prescribed fire. And so this is a hard day's work. So, but it's fun, it's rewarding, and it usually does a really good job for ecological management. I know we're going to hold questions to the end. I always do that as a matter of habit, throw the questions thing in there. I hope questions are going into the chat box. But with that, I'm going to turn this over to Joann.
Yes, we will get to some of these questions in a little bit, but first I'm going to introduce Joann and have her tell us a little more about her experience with prescribed burn. So Joann joined the Clifftop Board of Directors in 2010 after retiring from USDA rural development after 35 years of service. She was elected to the position of membership chair in 2011, and she's the editor of their newsletter Bluff Views, as well as the administrator of their Facebook page. Joann and her husband Mike live on 120 acres of bluff property near Valmeyer. 34 acres of their property is dedicated as the Illinois Ozarks Nature Preserve, and 80 acres is registered as the Luella Schaefer Memorial Hill Prairie Land and Water Reserve. They are the site stewards for White Rock Nature Preserve and Land and Water Reserve, co-owned by Clifftop and Heartlands Conservancy. Joann, can you pull up your PowerPoint presentation? And unmute yourself.
Okay.
Okay,
Here we
thank
go.
you.
Sorry. I didn't want to make any odd noises during Scott's presentation, so I thought I'd put it on mute. Thank you, Sarah. I'm so happy to be talking about burning. It's my favorite stewardship activity. And I know Scott said he wasn't a pyro, but I think there's a little pyro in all of us. We like to watch flames. But as someone told me a long time ago, a boring burn is a good burn. You don't want too much excitement when you're doing a prescribed burn. So let's discuss first, and why is my screen not moving? What the heck? This worked when we did practice, didn't it, Sarah?
Yeah.
Okay, any suggestions as to what I have done wrong here?
Well, I can see your front screen. Can you see your first slide on your screen?
I see my introductory screen, yes.
But you're clicking and they're not advancing?
Correct.
Try the arrow keys, front and back.
I have been. Let's see. Oop, now I stopped myself. I think can you still hear me, Sarah?
Yes.
Okay. Let's try this again. Yay. Okay.
All right.
Sorry, I'm not a very good.
Just a little technical difficulty. It's okay.
Yeah, we should have did a little humming while I was going through that. One of the first things that your burn boss will do, and you can hire a burn boss. Fortunately, we have an IDNR person that acts as burn boss for Clifftop quite often. And if it's your own property, you can act as your own burn boss. But one of the first things you want to do is fill out a prescribed burning plan. And what this does is it will list what weather conditions are ideal, what equipment you're going to need, how many volunteers you're going to need, things like that. For example, when we burn at Paul Whiteman Subterranean Nature Preserve, we don't want a wind coming from the east because that's going to throw smoke onto Kaskaskia Road, and that's a very busy road. So that's one of the things that would be indicated in your prescribed burning plan. Another thing you want to do is apply for an open burning permit with the Illinois EPA. You can apply for multiple locations with this. What Clifftop often does is in the summer, long before burning season, they'll apply for open burning permits for all of their owned or co-owned properties and any private properties that might need to be burned as well. That way everything's covered and you'll get your, it can take up to 90 days to get your open burning permit back from EPA. So it's good to do it long in advance. Then once you've got all that, and when you're getting ready to actually do a burn, the first thing you'll want to do is put in your fire breaks. Now on the left here, you can see the nice wide fire break there. That is a mode fire break, and that will just separate the areas that you want to burn from what you don't want to burn. And on the right, that's a picture of my husband putting in a fire break in the woods. And in that case, he's using a backpack blower and he's blowing the leaves off of the ground down to dirt. And we usually try to go at least 6 feet wide when we're putting in a fire break in the woods. Here I am in my personal protective equipment. I have a helmet on. That's very useful when you're burning in the woods in case something comes down and clunks you on the head. Goggles will help keep that smoke out of your eyes and keep them from dripping. All natural fiber clothing. You ask, why should I have all natural fiber clothing? Well, polyester melts. You don't want to be wearing anything polyester and have an ember land on you and have that melt into your skin. Not a good idea. So usually wool or cotton is preferred as your all natural fiber clothing. Then you'll have a Nomex fire retardant suit. Clifftop has quite a variety of them on hand. We've been able to purchase them through grants and people have donated, and we have all sizes. Leather gloves, if you've got to pick up anything hot, like a limb that's fallen out of your burn unit, you want to have good, heavy leather gloves. And sturdy leather boots. Most of the burning that we do take place in the bluff area. And if you've got to hike up and down bluffs, you want good, sturdy boots with a good grip on the bottom. And you don't want those leather boots to have any kind of polyester inserts because, again, that will melt. Here's our burn boss. Debbie Newman is going over the burn plan. She's telling all the volunteers what their jobs will be and just gearing everybody up for the burn. She will hand out a map of the burn unit. This map actually was a prairie burn that I did on my property. And I know it looks like a crooked smiley face, and I didn't realize this until long after I had made this map. But all the little green ovals were piles of cedar trees that we had taken out of this prairie. But that just gives the volunteers an idea of what they're going to be doing. Then it's also a good idea when you've got volunteers at a site that they're not familiar with, give them a map showing them a route that will take them from the burn unit back to safety. In this case, the green line shows how they would get from the burn unit down there in the yellow circle and follow that green line back to our house in case something were really bad to happen. Back to our burn boss, Debbie is checking the Kestrel. That's the little red thing in her hand. That will tell her the humidity, the temperature, and the wind direction, so that she makes sure that everything is as she expected it to be. This is the obligatory fire crew pre-burn photograph. In this case, I threw it in here to illustrate that we're all wearing harnesses for radios so that we can contact each other in case we need help with an escape, or if we've fallen and hurt ourselves, something like that. It gives us contact with each other. The young man in green here was not old enough to participate, so he was merely an observer. He was one of the volunteers' sons. Okay, we're ready to burn now. So how do we start that fire? With a drip torch. That's what's in our volunteer's hand here. Excuse me. The mix that we use in our drip torches is 4-to-1 kerosene to gasoline. There's other mixes that are used, but that seems to work best for us. Another tool is a council fire rake. Here you see Mike moving a log with the rake. Those triangular tines can be whacked into a log and move a pretty decent sized log out of the way. It can also be used to pull leaves away from a tree that you don't want to burn. Notice that yellow dot on that tree. That means that there's a hole or some vulnerability in that tree, and you don't want a pile of leaves up against it and to cause it to catch fire. In this case, I believe this particular tree was quite near the fire break, and so we didn't want it to catch fire and fall into the non-burn unit. Another tool that we use is a fire swatter or flapper. And that's kind of a misnomer because we don't want you to swat or flap at that fire. We want you to lay that piece of rubber on top of the flame and then use a circular motion to stop those flames. I find it helpful also to sometimes just step on the piece of rubber as well. And that's to just keep that fire from going outside the burn unit. Water packs. We have several different kinds. This one happens to be hard plastic. We also have metal ones and then soft packs. And believe me, if you've got 5 gallons of water in that and you're carrying that on your back for 6 hours, it gets pretty heavy. I'll show you a farther out view of this particular burn, but those two fellas are keeping that fire there. It's on Overlook Prairie at White Rock Nature Preserve, and we did not want to burn the talus slope, so we're trying to keep those flames and embers from going down where those cedar trees are below and catching them on fire. And here's a soft water pack on this volunteer. We also have a fire suppression unit, which is a 50-gallon water tank with a, I don't know how many gallons the foam tank is, but we can spray foam onto fire to put it out. In this case, Mike is spraying a tree that was up in the air. This was at a prescribed burn in November at Paul Whiteman Subterranean Nature Preserve. And this is not the day of the fire. This is the day after the fire. Thus, he wasn't dressed in fire gear. But this tree that was up in the air was still flaming a bit and smoking quite a lot. And just on the other side of Mike, there is a field that we did not want to catch on fire. So we thought it best if we just put this thing out. We've got 200 feet of hose, and there's a gasoline powered engine that will shoot that water a good 20 feet in the air. And what we use for foam, because it's cheap, is dish detergent, and it works really good. Now, you might think that a leaf blower is the last thing that you want to use for fire control, but it does work really good. Yes, it can fuel the flames, but it can also blow fuel away from the flames. If you have a spot over into an area that you don't want to burn, you can use a leaf blower to go to that spot over and blow all of the fuel, and by fuel I mean leaves and grasses and things, away from the flame, and then it will just put itself out. Here we had a couple volunteers with a leaf blower and a water pack. Another thing, and Scott didn't touch on this, but we have experimented with summer burns. Some people in the Illinois Department of Natural Resources think they are just the best things ever, and then there are some that think it's terrible and it's going to kill herps and all kinds of things. But this worked fairly good. This is a prairie on my property, and I was amazed at what good fire we got out of so much green that was in the prairie. I believe this was in September, not this year or 2020, it was several years ago. Sometimes you're at a fire until well after dark. And here you can see the dramatic view of flames as two different units are coming together. And what will happen there is they're just going toward each other, and when they meet, they'll go out. Now this is the farther view of that prescribed burn we had at Overlook Prairie. So you can see how high up all of the volunteers were. We had a photographer stationed down in the valley taking photographs. So I just thought this was kind of a cool picture to share with y'all. Now this is a prairie at my property. That map of the kind of crooked smiley face, this is the prairie that was. And this was burned March 2nd of 2017. And 3 months later, this is what it looked like. This prairie was burned March 7th of 2020, and these photos were taken on June 4th. So just in 3 months, this is the kind of flower production that you can see. It always amazes me, and I can't say enough about how prescribed burns help the landscape. And that is it for me. Sarah, back to you, and you can start asking questions, I suppose.
I'm coming back. Thank you, Joann. So Scott has actually been hard at work answering everyone's questions in the Q&A box, which I greatly appreciate. Scott, is there anything that you want to elaborate on? You've answered everything. Is there anything you want to elaborate on live?
No, a lot of questions have been really good ones. I've sent an email out in my email address to a few people to follow up. Joann's absolutely right. This came up at least twice in the questions about the timing of the burns. When's the burn season? We typically call the burn season from September to March, April. That's really a kind of a convenience thing. It's a safety thing. You're going to get better burn conditions during there, but she's absolutely right. There's a lot of push. A lot of people that I work with are talking about, green season burns and burning more in the growing season. And we know historically that was a reality. There were those drought years where, after a good 2 months of summer growth, all of a sudden you got this long, hot, dry period and fires burned. And so that tends to be better for promoting the forward growth, the flowers specifically, and the pollinators that go with those. So the reality is that we tend to focus that burn season, in those fall, winter, spring months, because in urban areas, at least, like where I'm working primarily, it becomes an air quality issue. You can't burn when you're going to have poor air quality days, and you might impact the people with breathing issues. And since I'm working in the urban interface constantly, we've got to really always be cognizant that we're not triggering as people with asthma. It's not my goal to go out there and manage nature and then, make a bunch of people out in the populace uncomfortable. So we go with the tools that they give us. We're going to try to burn a little bit more in the summer because I think it certainly favors those flowering plants more. But again, it's tough. It's tough to time these things correctly.
All right. So there were some people who were interested in seeing a couple of Scott's slides again. And we will be sending those out in the email tomorrow. So you can look at those again tomorrow when we send them to everyone. I think that's all for tonight. So I'm just going to wrap this up. I want to thank both Scott and Joann for joining us tonight. Your information was very informative. It was very informative, very interesting, and thank you so much for sharing your experiences with us. Our next webinar topic is community gardens on February 11th. If anyone's interested, you can find more information on our website or social media, and look for a follow-up email on the prescribed burn webinar from us tomorrow. So thank you very much, and good night, everyone.
Thank you.